Greetings. Today I will be discussing and analyzing Tony Stark and hopefully gaining some insight on what's wrong with one of the world's most loved superheroes. Let's begin by getting to know who he is. Tony Stark is a man that the whole world knows. A genius to some, simply a billionaire to the others, and a playboy to the ladies, and a philanthropist to the rest of the world. He himself tells Captain America that is what he is, a genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. Everyone knows him as such, but is that all he really is? Tony Stark, as the world knows him, is a man who grew up in a wealthy family and has a genius-level IQ. He built his first circuit board at age 4, his first engine at 6. He graduated MIT summa cum laude at 17, and eventually took over his father's company at the age of 21 after the sudden death of his parents, Howard and Maria. With such accomplishments, it's no wonder the world holds him in such a high standard. But what does the world actually know who he is? If we were to look deeper, what would we find about the supposed enigma that is Tony Stark? Well, if we rated him on the Big 5 personality profile, we'd get our first clue. First of all, we need to know what the Big 5 spectrum is. Well, it's what many psychologists consider the 5 fundamental dimensions of a personality. Often they believe one can determine a personality based on how low or how high an individual scores on each spectrum. To start off, we have conscientiousness, or the inner ability that we all have to do something reliably, organized, or meticulously, or simply put, to be careful. On this particular dimension, Tony Stark gets a low score. He does many things with reckless abandon or in a haphazard way. A prime example of this comes from the Avengers, when Tony Stark flies a warhead into a wormhole that leads to another dimension to destroy without New York being obliterated in the process. Secondly, we have extroversion. This trait is characterized by either being sociable or reserved. Our subject, Tony Stark, scales moderately on this particular dimension. By scoring this moderate score, it means he can either be a party animal or a social hermit. A prime example of this is the fact that he can either throw loud and outrageous parties or be stuck in a lab for 72 hours and more. Third on our journey to Tony's personality is agreeableness. Unfortunately for him, he has a low score on this. Agreeableness is essentially how forgiving or how critical someone can be. Tony scores lows on this because he's quick to incite and is easy to criticize others. He's a very confrontational person and often snaps back with rude or harsh comments. An example of this is in the Avengers, when Captain America and Tony start arguing, and Tony remarks with the comment, "A hero like you. You're a laboratory experiment, Rogers. Everything special about you came out of a bottle." This is a prime example of how Tony is quick to snap back in an argument. Next up is neuroticism. This is the level in which one can either be anxious or relaxed. Tony in this particular field scores high, meaning that he can often be quite high-strung. As active as his brain is, it's no shock that he doesn't sit still. But what is a surprise are the anxiety attacks that he later experiences after his incident with the New York wormhole. Lastly, on the personality field, is openness to new experience. Tony scores quite high on this one, for he is always seeking out newness. He's always building, always creating something new, whether it be on a suit, a car, a motorcycle, or any other type of technology he decides to work with. The disorder that I would be diagnosing him with would be post-traumatic stress disorder from the DSM-5 code 309.81. This diagnosis is described as being a developmental characteristic symptoms following exposure to one or more traumatic events. This traumatic event that he faces is one that continues to plague him with panic attacks and anxiety throughout the entirety of the third Iron Man movie, basing from the wormhole incident in New York. Support of these symptoms are included in Symptom number 1, which is directly experiencing a traumatic event, which is Tony directly flying into the wormhole with the nuke, which is the cause of his panic and anxiety attacks in the third Iron Man. The second system, dissociative reactions or flashbacks. The panic attacks Tony faces often are accompanied by these flashbacks where he cannot tell the difference between reality and where he is. Instead, he is just caught in the past. There are really no missing symptoms that Tony Stark has in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, in that he shows, even vaguely, all attempts of the previous sensations of anxiety and distress. One possible treatment is one called cognitive therapy, in which a therapist will help the patient understand about the trauma and challenge how they might think about it in the future. In the long run, this may not be very helpful to Mr. Stark, since it is not very clear he is very open with talking about his experiences and prefers to keep them locked up. Our final statements about the psychological disorders in films. This one, the portrayal is quite accurate, I believe, because when you have panic attacks, it is true that a traumatic event could scar you such a way, and even mentioning it could trigger this reaction of intense distress and not being able to see the reality when you are stuck in the past.